Welcome to I Just Don't Know, a podcast where we try to learn something new, challenge my opinions, and hope to make the misinformed informed. I can openly say I've spoken when I did not need to, been unnecessarily controversial, and shared my misinformed opinion, thinking it was not. In this podcast, I'll try to right some wrongs and take on a new topic each episode that I think I knew, but in fact, I just don't know. This episode is about role models, those that inspire us and those that have visions for the future, as well as self-awareness, idealism, and mastering your craft. It is about a deeply debated topic that divides families, businesses, and even nations, provoking both acts of violence and acts of defiance. They instill hope through our darkest days and help us take that terrifying first step into the unknown. They can motivate the masses and incite defining change when followers rally behind them. I am of course talking about leadership and leaders. Leadership could be boiled down to the simple act of putting the well-being of others before ourselves. But I think it is so much more than that. It is so easy to lend just a few traits to what a leader is based solely on your own experiences and perhaps role models in your own life. Therefore, in this episode, I'm going to challenge some traditional views of what a true leader is and perhaps what I think a great leader is, and also look at why some of the leaders that everyone knows about in history are not there by accident. So my assumption for this podcast episode is that I've often thought that to be a leader is to be remembered, idolised and loved, but I also recognise they are just as often demonised and hated, torn down and even killed by their own followers. And I've known what constitutes a good leader is much debated, and I've known that it's not straightforward, and I know it troubles the minds of academics and politicians and business leaders in the past for hundreds of years, and still does to this day. However, I don't think I've truly allowed time for myself to digest and break down why I see some people as good leaders and why I see some as not. So, in the past, I can see that perhaps I've always attributed leadership to those that have helped a people or a nation overcome adversity. Simple as that. And I've always associated being heroic, brave, inspiring, and leading by example as a key characteristic of the optimum leader. However, I think in more recent years, and perhaps as I've grown up and spent time in a full-time corporate role in London, that I've realised that there is definitely a structure to strong leadership. There is a theory to it. And one of the contributing factors to inspiring this episode is that I'm currently studying towards a Chartered Management Institute leadership qualification. And I've recently completed basically most of the reading for the first quite large module. And it really breaks down some concepts of leadership that I didn't realise could be put into these sort of pockets or bubbles where you can then apply them to real life and categorize them in a way that allows you to adapt according to the situation and allow you to figure out why some of the great leaders that we're going to talk about in this episode are where they are and how they managed their situation and why they've become so memorable. So listen to find out why this is, and hope you enjoy. So I'm going to start this episode looking at who the great leaders are in history, and according to the internet, who they think generally are the greatest leaders of all times, the GOATs of our time. And I found an article here outlining the 10 great leaders from history in the Industry Leaders magazine. So I have a feeling their position will be coming from a sense of business and change. And they've defined leadership as a process through which a person influences and motivates others to get involved in accomplishment of a particular task. They say this definition is universally accepted, but it does fail to define the particular paths and ways of people who are deemed as great leaders. So they are great leaders in their own separate ways. They do say that all great leaders are unique, so they do acknowledge that. But there is definitely a similarity, a commonality, that they lead the masses to innovation and new ideologies. So they clearly state that efficient leaders are men and women who really move people and motivate people to do something and to go into a higher plane of existence or something, take that society to something greater and better. And the number one leader that seems to be coming up consistently, not just on this article, but others as well that I've seen, is Mahatma Gandhi. And if you don't know who Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi is, he is some background on him. So he was born an ordinary boy in India, and from what I understand, he was a bit of a troublemaker actually when he was growing up, and he then went off to and he broke a lot of religious rules, eating meat, smoking, drinking, and then he went off to the UK to study law, and then after that he then came back and moved from India to South Africa, where he really realized, he found out the crazy and ridiculous divide between how sort of whites and coloured people were being treated. And I think he was thrown off a bus or a train for not taking off his seat, not sort of giving up his seat. And from that, he built the idea of, in his mind clearly, that he needed to make this change and make a difference. But what he is mostly known for is when he returns to India is his policy of non-violence and protests through civil disobedience, leading his country to freedom in 1947 from the British rule to India's full independence. So his characteristics that people give him is that he's resilient, he's knowledgeable, he has fantastic people skills, and he takes the motivational approach and leads by example, that non-violence. And unfortunately, he does meet his end by being assassinated in close quarters, which is a sad ending. But he is very recognizable. Gandhi, I think the word Gandhi is universally, especially in the Western world, is recognized as well. He basically epitomizes the perfect movement, the political movement, the motivational movement. There's no violence. He achieves his goals, and it's inspiring, and it's inspired movies and films. So fair enough, that is a lot of people's top leader. You have others as well. George Washington, creating a nation, again, very similar. But how much we actually know about him as a leader is solely based on historical documents, and in a time when things were accepted differently than they are now, so it's very difficult to compare when there's that amount of time in between. So George Washington's behaviour and views on things would be very different from now, so it's quite hard to bring it into the modern world. Perhaps a bit more recently, though, Abraham Lincoln is a top leader, the 16th president of the United States. He's known as one of the best presidents, one of the most favourite presidents in terms of US polls, and he was key in keeping America together, leading the Union against the Confederates in the American Civil War, keeping the US states together, and being a sort of a proponent, an advocate for the emancipation of slaves and in getting rid of slavery in the South, and encouraging the American people to come together under one banner. And he's known for his clear determination, his persistence, and strong beliefs. And he was trying to make sure that his country follows his ideals and gets everyone behind it. You then have slightly more controversial leaders that people have outlined that they can't help but this article by the Leaders magazine can't help but mention the likes of Hitler. Unfortunately, could be classed as a great leader because of what he manages to do with Germany, uniting them and invading 10 countries across Europe. Yes, pretty impressive. Whether he was solely can be attributed or solely responsible for that is debatable. It is here. I do remember when studying it at school and at universities, his speeches and how he would turn up an hour and a half late, but people would wait and build the tension because they just want to see him talk and do his speeches. And he was very impressive, his speeches. And if you've seen videos, it's terrifying how sort of graphic and dynamic he is in his speeches. And that is a key characteristic of a good leader. They need to have that oratory skills, that charisma. So, interesting topic. There's others like Muhammad, who led the people of Islam against the people that study that worship idols and different religions in that area. He managed to unite people behind one religion and managing to calm that society into having certain morals and principles. But again, there isn't that much known about them that hasn't been perhaps skewed by the view of religion. You can't take necessarily as accurate history because it's been sort of influenced by the massive religion of Islam. So it's tricky to really know that story. Again, Mao Zedong in the Chinese revolution, leading the People's Republic of China, completely taking over the country, kicking out the existing government off to Taiwan, and repelling the Japanese during World War II. Whether he was a great leader, again, we only know what we know about him from sources from China, and while there is a lot written about him, whether you could class him as a great leader with all the bad things he did is tricky. You then have Nelson Mandela, and a very interesting character that everyone knows, perhaps in the same sort of category as Gandhi, you could say. He imprisoned for a long time and then finally set free and becoming the first black president of South Africa, ending apartheid. And being sort of, because he was spent a long time in prison, that sort of adds to the story that he was of the injustice and then finally getting his justice, and that sort of full circle. And when you're looking at a leader, you want that good story, and it's more digestible by people. People can understand something better when it has almost a start, middle, and end. You then have others that they've outlined, so Julius Caesar, Fidel Castro. You could say Caesar's more on the military side. Castro, again, is about a nation. So there's a lot of things about nations. That sort of the rise of nationalism in the last 100 years, 150 years, has made us think that anyone who can motivate a nation or bring a nation together is classed as a great leader, and that I can see that. But before that, you didn't really have nationalism. You had the kings and queens and the republics that dominated the world, and they were leaders by appointment, by divine right, and it was up to them if they wanted to be a good leader or not. And often they were seen as good leaders just because of their position. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. And then the last one is you have Winston Churchill, that perhaps in the UK is most recognised as a great leader, controversial figure in some sense. He's been depicted in movies and TV shows like The Crown, The Darkest Hour is slightly different. whether he's a bumbling old man or very wise old man or revolutionary in his thinking, trying to disrupt the conservative ways of looking. But also everyone knows he was a controversial figure in his personal choices, the way he behaved, his choices and what he voted for before the war and during his role in the Boer War in Africa. And and his, I think he was secretary, not a secretary of state, but maybe of the Admiralty, overseeing the Navy, and he made some controversial decisions there with regards to diverting food away from India, or the empire at the time in India, to help troops in Australia or back in Europe. I'm not sure exactly the detail, but that did lead to famine in India. So there is an argument that his choices were controversial, and therefore could you categorize that as a great leader? Was he just in the right time, right place at the right time? And that takes me nicely on to what a leader is, in the sense that, is it sometimes just them being in the right time at the right place at the right time, and some of their characteristics just sort of fitting the situation, whether it's overcoming adversity or bringing people together, and they're naturally good at it. There's a lot of debate in that sense, but what I do want to do is look at, before we go into sort of perhaps the theory side of it, and I break down some of what I've learned and realized, is that I want to share a couple of sort of leaders that I see when I was growing up, and who do I think were leaders. And the first one that some of you might know is that I've always been a big fan of since I was younger. I just loved Sharp. If you've ever heard of Sharp, it's a character created in history by a historical fiction novelist, Bernard Cornwell, and the role of Sharp in the Napoleonic Wars from 1790 to around 1790 to 1815. Sharp is played by, in the TV series in the 90s, and all the way up until, I think the last one was about 10 years ago, perhaps 2012 or something like that. And he is played by Sean Bean, who I'm a huge fan of anyway. And so in his role as Sharp, he is a leader of a rifleman squadron using revolutionary rifles that fire further than the traditional musket that the French are using and the British sort of main sort of infantry units are using. So they are a specialist squadron, but Sharp is very much their leader, going through very difficult times where in the sort of the Portuguese, in the sort of the Iberian Peninsula campaign against the French, and so in Portugal and Spain, and then later France, and the Battle of Waterloo. So that's a little history recap of who Sharp is. But his role as a leader is, he's a thug. He sets the example. He's the first into the breach. He's willing to fight his own men just to earn their respect. It's very traditional. It's very almost like an army. It's that sort of what you would categorize a leader is if you were in a sort of the armed forces. What do they see as a great leader? And Sharp, in some sense, epitomizes that. But he's also a bit sort of rough around the edges, doesn't follow protocol, doesn't always follow procedures perfectly. And I think some of the movies and the TV show really shows that quite well, and the books as well touch on that. His sort of doesn't really abide by the ridiculous protocols and traditions of the upper class. And if the main one of the sort of the story arcs is that he's a working class guy, and he gets promoted through the ranks from a sergeant to an officer, and therefore he's in a world that he shouldn't be in, and a lot of people try to make that point to him very clear. So, in a nutshell, then he's up against it, but he gets through it, fights through, sets the example, does incredible things, achieves great sort of great feats of bravery and courage, but also makes mistakes, isn't necessarily the best, does the right thing, protects women, protects kids, protects children, protects his men, So very traditional sort of leadership roles. And I've always seen that, well, that is a leader then, but it's quite a traditional leader. And it's almost a bit too polished. As much as they do make him a bit rough around the edges, it's still a little bit too polished. And later on, perhaps, I wanted to use another example of a leader, is that some of you might know is Rick from The Walking Dead. And I think the thing about Rick is, if you've watched the first few seasons anyway, when I think I stopped sort of season 4 or 5 or something like that, but definitely in the first few seasons when it is very good, Rick has to play that role where there's a band of people in this TV show, if you don't know, where it's the apocalypse and everyone is turned into zombies, and it's highly infectious if you get bitten. And so he's leading a group of people, including his son and his wife and his friend and a few other people, and he leads them to try and find out somewhere to be safe and trying to find out what's happening, what's going on, get food, deal with all these different issues. But there's a point where I think there's a great clip that I think I've seen quite a few times near the end of the second season or something like that, or the first season, where he really talks about it's his way or no way. And because people don't realize how dangerous it is. They have to follow the rules. They have to protect the boundaries of their camp. They cannot let up. And I think they make jokes that it's called the Rick-tatorship. And I think later on in like season 4 or 5, where he gets really rugged and they've lost where they were staying, I think a prison, and they stumble across a nice fenced off area where everyone lives almost like there hasn't been an apocalypse, and they live a lovely life, and they're a bit lax with their guard, their guard roles and their picket lines to make sure no sort of these zombies are Walking Dead zombies are coming through. And he makes it very clear to them that they just don't take it seriously, and he becomes very clear that he sets that example by, I think, sort of throwing a dead body or something, a dead zombie that manages to get in through the gate in front of everyone and says, "This is serious. You are not taking it seriously. It's my way or no way. You've got to follow me. You've got to listen to me." And it's almost like quite vicious. It's quite very graphic, and it's probably one of the best moments of the series before it goes a bit rubbish, as some people might argue. But I definitely like some of these moments, and it's played by another actor who I really like. It's what's his Adam? Rick? So you got Rick Grimes. He's played by Andrew Lincoln. Yeah, and it was Andrew. So I'm a big fan of Andrew Lincoln as an actor. I think he's great. And I like the stuff before he joined Walking Dead, so that's probably helps. That's why I'm a bit biased, but I also saw him as an interesting leader, and I wanted to mention him because he's not that polished, and I don't really know what happens to him later on, but definitely in those first 4 or 5 seasons, he's definitely a leader. He sets the example. He tries to run away from responsibility for a bit after he gets too sort of into the craziness of it all and killing and all that. But again, he has to come back and he has to be their leader, but he's definitely not a polished leader. He doesn't do things perfectly. Things go wrong around him because of his choices. People die, and things don't necessarily go to plan. And he's quite forceful in his authority, and almost a bit controversially. Then he becomes but you would still say he was a good leader for them. And there are people that challenge him, but then because perhaps of the situation, he doesn't like being challenged as well. So Rick is a really interesting one. But on the whole, what I've recognised here is that what I see as a leader is definitely heroic, definitely first into the breach, as you could say, Henry V, Shakespeare, first into the breach. I think the Siege of Harfleur, they're the ones that will go into the unknown or go into danger first. So therefore they set the example, lead by example. They get stuck in. Ultimately, they're likable. I generally see as most leaders are generally likable, and they're perhaps unique in comparison to Others, they definitely don't just sort of fit in and look like everyone else or try to conform to the norm. But how does that type of leader, how do you actually replicate that in real life? How do I actually, if I wanted to be a better leader, how do I actually do that? And I don't think it's that easy. I'm not fighting any wars or going out anywhere dangerous necessarily daily. I'm not leading people through adversity and that is so clear and horrific, like in The Walking Dead, or through a war that as sharp was. So how do you actually replicate that? And so that is where I need to challenge that view of what a great leader is. And actually there is other things, there's other elements of being a great leader that can be done in real life. And so we're going to touch on that in the second part. So I hope you've enjoyed it so far, but listen on to hear about how you can be a leader in the modern day. So I want to start with contingency theory of leadership. So this is when leaders learn that they have to act differently across different situations, and they have to realize the importance of their personal style is vital in being a good leader. The definition of this theory is sort of led by an academic called Frederick Fielder in the 1960s, where he outlined that effective leadership style depends on the situational contingencies, such as the nature of the task specifically and how certain or uncertain it was. So very much task-oriented focus on what leadership is. Can they complete the task? There is also, you could break it down by another interpretation of this by Lorsch in 2010, that into 4 categories. Leadership is based, or this theory is based on the leader's power and influence and his or her chosen goals. Number 2, the follower's expectations of who's following this leader. Number 3, the complexity of the organization that they're leading. And number 4, the certainty and uncertainty of the task, a very similar view. So the contingency leadership model is really interesting because it's very much focused on adapting to the circumstances, and it implies that the optimal way of a leader should function as the situation develops, and therefore a leader doesn't behave the same every time, which is again a controversial view in some sense, because people don't like it when people veer away from their principles or the way they behave, or they act differently, or they have a different point of view. I think these days when you see someone in politics vote one way or do something, then people pull up what they voted towards all in the past and they try to see that as a negative thing. But then you don't realize that perhaps a good leader has to adapt to the different situation, and there is a context to why they voted that way. And people don't necessarily recognize that. But there's definitely an element of when people are not consistent, people get suspicious. But actually, this suggests that a strong leader must adapt to the situation, and that means they won't necessarily act in the same way every time. So there's other factors to this contingency theory that outlined by Victor Vroom and Philip Yetten in 1973. It says there's 5 types of decision-making styles that a leader can demonstrate if you apply this theory. And the first one is very much looking at decision quality. And the structure of the problem, the informal availability, and the significance of the subordinates by it. And so very much almost like a critical thinking way of looking at leadership. It cannot be defined in one sense. It can only be defined once you look at a certain situation. You can't apply one set of characteristics or approach to be a good leader. You have to know all the details first. So it's a bit of sitting on the fence, and while it has been extensively researched and looked at by lots of different academics, and arguably does make sure a leader looks at all of the factors before they act or make a decision, it does make it harder to take on board when you're not giving a definitive answer of how to be a good leader. It's just make sure you consider all the factors and then make a decision. So it's not really there's a bit of a confusion about where this theory sits, and there's a bit of issue about how you can actually measure it and how you can apply it because of its sheer diversity. So that is what I wanted to start off, because then I want to go into slightly different, more defined theory of leadership that has been quite interesting, is the sort of job-centered leadership. And this is what I think in the modern, well, in the current times, being job-centered or task-focused is so important, and it's where you can really be successful. And I think that's how you can be very successful in the company that I work at and other companies that I've seen. So job-centered leaders often closely supervise subordinates to make sure they perform their tasks and follow the specified procedures. And these type of leaders rely on reward, punishment, and a legitimate power to influence the behaviors of their followers. So you could say like a position. It's academic Lee in 1999 says it clearly contrasts with employee-centered or people-centered leadership that corresponds with a type of leadership style which we'll touch on in very shortly, which is the transformational leadership style. So this is where it gets into a debate of job-centered leadership versus relationship or employee-centered leadership. And the key different sort of there's a key sort of academic that has come up a lot in my research is Burns, outlining that the basic issue with this type of leadership is that the task of how to get a team member to perform well is that you have to continuously show the stick, but also offer the proverbial carrot, the carrot and the stick. But with the stick approach is more very traditional, sort of showing if they don't do something, this is what are the consequences, and being autocratic. And you can go back into the past where people just followed what was expected of them in the military. People just do what is asked of them. But that doesn't work these days. People need to have a motivation or incentive to know why they need to do something. But if that carrot is not right or it's not agreed upon, then you get into trouble with this sort of task-orientated or task-centered way of leadership. So it's actually brought up that when a leader is actually highly task-orientated, efforts and all their efforts are focused on targets and what the goal is, they sometimes lose sight of the vision. And you do need leaders to veer away from job-centered leadership or task-orientated leadership to be a bit more relationship-focused, where they can focus more on creating harmony at work and maintaining a moral boosting climate, as outlined by a research set by a couple of academics, Sanchez-Burks and Nisbet and Ybarra, in the year 2000. So you need a high degree of participation from the employees or your team when you are a leader. And so being solely task-orientated, you can sometimes fall short of getting this buy-in because you haven't created an atmosphere of, as I outlined, harmony. And they've actually coined it socio-emotional balance. And it's so important to maintain this balance, and not only just for the team, but also for the leader. And then you could look at this in sort of a cultural view and how people have adapt to the role of a leader and follower around the world. So there was a study about 20 years ago by his name was Boo, and they looked at how the Chinese and Asian cultures have a high propensity to take directions. They have, I've been told about when I was in Asia about their sort of respect for authority. You would never jump a layer to go talk to your boss's boss. You would not expect to be able to speak to the CEO. You would only be able to speak to the CEO once you are that layer, that rung just below them. You could not jump that. But then on the other side of things, in sort of the American side and Western Europe side, perhaps the UK first, they don't necessarily have that propensity to take on directions, and they only will take directions from those that they respect, those that have the right principles, and they set a clear vision, and they are reliant, and to get sort of the buy-in from followers in America and the UK, you need to really focus on the relationships. You cannot rely just on task-orientated leadership, where you sort of make clear the punishment and make clear the reward. So, but then from my understanding, and I might be slightly wrong here from what I see in sort of the Nordic countries, the Nordic culture, it's very flat in the sense that they don't have any authority at all, really. You have your CEOs and your leaders, and they are not expected at all to have any form of sort of privilege over or barriers between them and an intern. An intern should have access to the CEO and have just as much time with the CEO of the company as the CFO, and creating a sort of a culture of where there isn't that sort of overlooking someone or being better than others. But that doesn't really go down well. I don't think that's definitely not the case in America. I don't think there's a clear sense of hierarchy in the US still, and obviously there is a very strong sense of hierarchy in sort of the Asia cultures and perhaps most of the rest of the world. So that is job-centered, sort of task-orientated leadership. It's clear that it definitely facilitates high performance, and I can see people that I've known in my time working, people who are very task-orientated, job-centered leadership, and show those qualities. And I used this approach a number of times, that they do achieve their goals and they meet deadlines, and they really are very effective at their jobs and getting the job done. However, for a long-term application, an academic called Bartley in the 70s, that it can, when you're focusing just on high productivity, job-centered leadership, it can, after a long period, correlate with absenteeism and grievance across the group. And arguably, you can see that in my job, where the turnover is fairly consistent with London, but it's still low in comparison to what you would want it to be. So I can see getting the job done, balance with keeping harmony and maintaining that longevity, and keeping people bought in and they're willing to be present and active as a member of or a follower. It is not easy to balance that between job-centered leadership and relationship-centered leadership. So the next one I wanted to look at is something that really interests me, actually, and it's not as simply as black and white as what we've just touched on there. It's more about the difference between transactional leadership and transformational leadership. They are similar to the different theories I've just touched on, but I like the different approaches that academics have made over the years in looking at the difference between this approach and showing that it is not either or, and it's not necessarily either a balance as well. You can merge the two, and that's what I quite like. So sort of started with Burns again in the 70s and 80s, and also an academic called Bass in the mid-80s as well. You have that transformational leadership is understood when a leader has the ability to move those influence to them and transcend their own self-interest, for the good of the group, organization, or country. And transactional leadership refers to the transaction or exchange of something of value the leader possesses or controls that the follower wants in return of his or her services. So it doesn't mean that there has to be a stick if we're using the carrot and the stick idea in the task-orientated leadership approach. Transactional leadership is more about an exchange of time, of effort for some form of reward or gain. And I think it doesn't mean it has to be money for time. It can be experience. It can be emotional support. It can be items or things. So it breaks it down into a little bit better in a way that could be better understood. So then it does rely on contingent reinforcement, though. It implies that a manager needs to create a certain path to make sure the person that their follower receives the reward that they're asking for, and they need to reinforce them that by the followers being compliant, that they will gain what is promised in that exchange. So overall, transactional leadership theory is built on the idea that leader-follower relations are definitely based on a series of exchanges or implicit bargains between the two. So overall, the general notion you could say is when the job and the environment of the follower fail to provide the necessary motivation, direction, or satisfaction, the leader has to, through their behavior, make effective compensation for the deficiencies. And this is outlined by Bass in 1985 very nicely, that transactional leadership, when the situation has not got that clear vision because there's perhaps a level of uncertainty, for example, the last few years with lockdowns and things like that, not really knowing what's going to happen next or whether we'll be able to do certain things. How do you sort of make up for that sort of negative impact on the environment? Well, you have to make it up with a change in the exchange between the leader and the follower. So the way it can be flexible makes this transactional leadership approach and transformational leadership approach that we're going to touch on now quite effective, I think. And when we go back to some of the examples of what I mentioned in the first half with like Gandhi, things like that, being able to adapt to the situation, motivate people differently, not stick to a certain way of leadership like with a carrot and a stick, but actually change what you're exchanging for their buy-in, being flexible with knowing that what they want, or changing what you give them in return for their support, allows you to be a really effective leader. And with regards to transformational leadership, that's where it gets interesting, because transformational leadership are those that oppose rigid bureaucratic leadership, and they're highly effective when applied correctly. But often with change management and when things change, most changes fail, and transformations of changing people, most of the time it does fail. But when it is applied effectively or correctly, then it can have a massive impact. And it's outlined here. There's sort of 4 I's that transformation leadership can be attributed to. So you have the idolized influence. So there you influence people's moral fiber, ethical fiber, personal conduct, and you serve as a role model. So some of the things I mentioned earlier about what I think a leader is. The second I is inspirational motivation. So those that create a clear and exciting vision for the future. And then the next one is the intellectual stimulation. You empower others, you get them to be innovative and challenge their behaviors. And this is one that I really want to get better at and do more at work and in my life. Be able to empower people to problem solve and innovate is something that I reckon CEOs and definitely the leader of my company is trying to do, and I think they definitely achieve it in some ways. But to try to empower someone to overcome their own problems or challenges is very, very difficult. And then lastly is the individualized consideration, and this is where it becomes, which is where I like this approach, where it's adapting to the individual. You need to know, in order to know the needs of many, you need to know the needs of the few. And this is where perhaps politicians in the UK anyway overdo this one, and they think just because they've got that insight of a few people, they've got their examples of, oh, I went to meet that person, then that person who lived on that street and they had this issue and they were telling about it. It's sort of, if you show it off too much, you don't necessarily know the needs of the many. And this is where transformational leadership, you create those relationships where you have that insight on the ground, but you don't have to shout about it. And that's what I think is key for a transformational leader. One of the things about transformational leaders, though, they are focused on ideals, a vision. They're outlined here as willing to take risks, challenge the norm, the status quo, willing to fail. They've got great charisma. You've got the likes of sort of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, all these great business leaders in the past that can be seen as transformational leaders. Elon Musk now, you could argue, is a transformational leader. But transformational leaders, there's definitely a time and place for transformational leaders. And most of the time, there is an element of transaction that is needed to prop up or build the foundation for when transformational leaders are needed. So therefore, it is argued that transactional leadership is more commonplace, and there are great leaders out there who are mostly transactional and occasionally transformation. They're perhaps quiet. They don't show off their charisma, and they're not the loudest, but they get the job done. They adapt to the situation. They keep their followers bought into the situation, mixing up what their exchange is for their buy-in, and they adapt to the situation. They're not really known that well, but if you look at all of the people I mentioned earlier, Gandhi, Muhammad, Winston Churchill, Hitler, and Julius Caesar, they were all pretty much transformational leaders. And it's often transformational leaders that get the limelight because they want to break the norm. They have ideals, they inspire, and they motivate people to do what they want them to do. But that's where it gets dangerous, because people like to follow. I think humans naturally want to follow people. They look for that guidance. But when you're not getting something in return, that's when things are getting a bit tricky. And that's why transformational leaders are great in certain moments, but it's actually transactional leadership when someone is getting something in return and they've agreed upon it, and then they will follow that leader, respect them, and that person is understanding that person's needs to the best level of detail possible, then that is actually just as good and great leadership, and while it doesn't get the limelight, I think it's very, very impressive to be an effective transactional leader or show transactional leadership qualities and be able to manage the situation so well that you know what needs to be done. So overall, very interesting, different theories, and I want to finish up on a video I watched in my sort of studying of this course that by a well-known YouTube video person, Simon Sinek. I'm sure most of you have heard of, but he outlines how the respect and perks and money and service that you get as a leader is not for the person. It's most of the time it's for the position. Whether you're the president, whether you're an ambassador, whether you're a team leader or a captain of your football team, whatever, it comes with the position, not the person. And therefore, you can only hold on to these benefits as long as the leader abides by the principles agreed upon. And this is where it gets difficult as a leader, because agreeing on those principles, that is what takes time. But ultimately, you're going to go in the right direction. He says that if a leader must sacrifice his or her own interests for the greater good of the group, and if you do that, and you think of others before yourselves, like I said, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, leadership could be boiled down to putting others before ourselves. Then that is what great leadership is. So overall, in summary, there is so much more to what a leader is, and while I have always seen leaders as heroic and pushing a group through adversity and fighting in wars and battles and times of desperate need, while that is a good way to become a leader, or be seen as a great leader and get a lot of the limelight, in reality, there are some approaches of leadership that are technical. They require diligence, commitment, and if you can apply them effectively, and I wish I can soon in the future as I develop more as a person, then that is how you eventually become a great leader. So I hope you enjoyed it, and please like or subscribe this podcast, and listen to all my past episodes if you'd like, and keep an eye out for future episodes. Thanks so much.